So today we're going to be looking at the urinary system, and a urologist is the medical specialty that deals with urinary tract disorders. Often a urologist also performs vasectomies. So the urinary system consists of four components: the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. The kidneys. There's two of these, and their main function is to filter out waste products from blood plasma and incorporate them into the urine that then would be urinated out of the body. The kidneys are bean-shaped, about 5 inches in length, and found in the lower back. The kidneys, remarkably, since they only weigh maybe less than 1% of your total body mass, the kidneys receive something like 25% of all the blood pumped by the heart each minute. That would be the cardiac output. So generally the blood supply to an organ is roughly proportional to its mass, but that's not the case with the kidneys. They receive a lot of blood. That's 1/4 of all the blood pumped by the heart. If you look at the left ventricle, pumps its blood into the aortic arch, and then the aorta goes through the diaphragm down into the abdominal cavity. The renal arteries are actually pretty darn large and obviously carry a lot of blood into the kidney, and that underscores how important it is to filter out these impurities from blood plasma to make urine. The kidneys are drained by the ureters, and there's one of these per kidney, and the ureters carry urine from the kidney, where the urine is made, to the urinary bladder, where the urine is stored. The ureters are lined with one-way valves, similar construction to what we saw with the veins, and the smooth muscle within the wall of the ureters contracts by peristalsis, and that helps to push the urine from one valve section to another in a unidirectional flow from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. There's one urinary bladder, often just called the bladder, and it's a storage bag for urine. The urethra is the tube that drains urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. The length of the urethra is quite different between males and females. In males, because of the penis, the urethra is about 8 inches in length. Females, because it empties in the vestibule region between her legs, it's only about 1.5 inches. So bacteria live in that area, or live in the vestibule area, and they get into the urethra, and because the urethra in females is shorter, females are more vulnerable to UTIs. And a UTI would be a urinary tract infection, and that's primarily because the bacteria in females has a shorter distance to travel up the urethra to the bladder. The main function of the urinary system certainly is to form urine, and in that respect the kidney regulates the chemical composition of not just plasma but other fluid compartments as well. If you regulate the chemical composition of plasma, you also regulate the chemical composition of other fluid compartments, because they're all in flux with one another. So we know that plasma, when it moves through capillary walls, becomes interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid, when it enters cells, would be the cytosol, and of course excess interstitial fluid, so it doesn't accumulate, will move into lymph vessels and make its way back to the subclavian veins, where it becomes plasma once more. So if you regulate the chemical composition of plasma, you'll have an effect on the chemical composition of other fluid compartments in the body as well. The urinary system, as it makes urine, gets rid of a number of what you call waste products from the body. So waste would be essentially any chemical that is useless to cells or chemicals that are in excess of what the cells need. Some waste chemicals, if they accumulate in the body, can be toxic to cells. So waste includes, surprisingly, excess water. It actually is possible to have so much water in the body that red blood cells will burst and you die. So you can have too much water. In other words, you sit down, you just drink and drink and drink and drink, and water becomes in excess. And as a result, that extra water is useless and you need to get rid of it. So urine helps to get rid of excess water. Generally, we take in an excess of salt ions with the food that we eat, particularly someone like me that likes a lot of salt. And these salt ions, as they're absorbed and circulate within the blood vascular system, can be in excess of what cells need. So the kidney will put extra salt ions beyond what cells need into the urine and get rid of it. Waste also includes these nitrogen waste products or nitrogen containing waste products. We've mentioned them before, but I'm going to run down through them again. So ammonia, urea, uric acid, and creatinine. Ammonia actually has two forms in the body, because ammonia, as it forms from the deamination of amino acids, will react with water to form ammonium ions. And ammonium ions are a form of ammonia in the body. So whenever you see an ammonium ion, just know that it is a form of ammonia. So ammonia, if it builds up, is very, very toxic to neurons. And if you don't get rid of it, you develop what's known as ammonia toxicity. And that will kill you quickly, within a matter of days. So urea is a nitrogen waste product that forms in the liver from ammonia. So ammonia is taken up by liver cells, hepatocytes, and reacted with carbon dioxide in liver cells to form urea. And then the urea that forms leaves the liver, goes into the blood, and is incorporated by the kidney into urine. So ammonia is very toxic, and the liver helps to remove it quickly from the blood and convert it to a less toxic form. That would be the urea. Uric acid is a nitrogen waste product that forms from the breakdown of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. Actually, uric acid can reach relatively high concentrations in the renal pelvis, and if that occurs, the uric acid will crystallize or precipitate out of a solution and form uric acid crystals that are known as kidney stones. Creatinine is a nitrogen waste product that comes from the breakdown of creatine phosphate in skeletal muscle cells. So another function of the urinary system is to release erythropoietin, or EPO, when the blood has low levels of oxygen or is hypoxic. And EPO helps to resolve the hypoxic condition by stimulating an increase in red cell production. And of course, the greater density of red cells means you're going to pick up more oxygen from the lungs that you can distribute to the cells of the body. Another function of the urinary system is to help control the blood pressure through RAS. So RAAS stands for renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And it's a system that helps to regulate blood pressure. It's a homeostatic mechanism. So let's start with a normal blood pressure of blood perfusing the kidney. And if the pressure of the blood perfusing the kidney drops below normal, that will stimulate juxtaglomerular cells in the kidney to secrete renin into the blood. Renin is a compound that converts angiotensinogen, which is the plasma protein made in the liver, to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted by ACE to angiotensin 2. ACE is an enzyme found associated with cells in the lung, and ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. I think I mentioned early in the course when we were covering the cardiovascular system that I take a medication known as an ACE inhibitor to help lower my blood pressure because I have hypertension. So, angiotensin 1 is converted by ACE to angiotensin 2, and that's the end of this cascade. Angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor of arterioles. It has a similar effect, at least in that regard, to epinephrine, but it's even more powerful than epinephrine. And when you vasoconstrict the smooth muscle cells within the walls of arterioles, you'll increase the peripheral resistance. An increase in the peripheral resistance will lead to an increase in blood pressure. Another effect of angiotensin 2 is to stimulate the release of a steroid hormone called aldosterone, or aldo, from the cortex of the adrenal gland. And aldosterone has a number of effects. I'll add a few more later. But aldosterone helps to increase water reabsorption in the kidney, which would decrease the loss of water in the urine. And this effect of aldosterone helps to maintain blood volume, and that helps to contribute to a stable blood pressure. I'm not going to detail the structures of the urinary system, but please make sure that you know everything that we covered in lab about the anatomy of the urinary system for our lecture test. So, moving on. There are three processes that form urine. Glomerular filtration, which I'll abbreviate with an F. Tubular reabsorption, that I'll abbreviate with an R, and tubular secretion, that I'll abbreviate with an S. Glomerular filtration. So what we're going to find in a nutshell is that glomerular filtration is when blood plasma within the glomerular capillaries ends up as filtrate within the glomerular capsule. So about 20% of the plasma in blood that flows through the glomerular capillaries, or the glomerulus, is forced out of the glomerular capillaries by blood pressure into the capsular space of the glomerular capsule, and that forms filtrate, a modified plasma in the glomerular capsule. The driving force for filtration is a hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic means fluid pressure, called blood pressure. And it turns out that the blood pressure, the pressure of blood in the glomerular capillaries, is around 55 millimeters of mercury, which is over 2 times greater than any other capillary bed. And that has to do with the different diameters of the afferent arteriole and the efferent arteriole. The diameter of the afferent arteriole is very large, and the diameter of the efferent arteriole is very small. So when you move a large volume of blood from the afferent arteriole through the glomerular capillaries, and that large volume meets a small diameter vessel, like clamping down on the nozzle of a hose, it will create a back pressure. And that back pressure is the elevated blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries. The filtrate that forms is a modified plasma, So we'll look at the composition, or what's in that filtrate. Well, first of all, there's a lot of water that gets filtered. In fact, the two kidneys together make something like 48 gallons of filtrate in the glomerular capsule. That's 180 liters each day. If reabsorption of those 48 gallons of filtrate that form in the glomerular capsule did not occur, then you would urinate 48 gallons of urine a day. Well, clearly that doesn't happen. So we're going to find that by far most of the water, over 99% of the water that gets filtered is reabsorbed. So a solution consists of a solvent, in this case water, and the chemicals dissolved in the solvent, and that would be the solute. So some of the solute are chemicals dissolved in the water that we find in the filtrate include salt ions, like sodium ions and chloride ions, potassium ions, magnesium ions, sulfate ions, phosphate ions. Organic nutrients, they get filtered, like glucose, amino acids, and vitamins, and all of the nitrogen waste products, urea, creatinine, uric acid, and ammonia, either as ammonia NH3 or as ammonium ions. What doesn't get filtered out of the glomerular capillaries and end up in the filtrate includes red cells, white cells, and platelets, as well as large plasma proteins such as albumin, prothrombin, antibodies. So the filtrate contains these chemicals, but we don't find red cells or other formed elements or large proteins in the filtrate. So this is a overview of glomerular filtration, or filtration. So this would be the renal artery. And the renal artery branches repeatedly, eventually giving rise to afferent arterioles. Again, if there are 1 million nephrons per kidney, then there would be 1 million afferent arterioles, 1 million of everything that you see here. So the blood coming in from the afferent arteriole enters the glomerular capillaries, and the high blood pressure within the glomerular capillaries forces blood plasma, about 20% of blood plasma, into the capsular space of a glomerular capsule. And when plasma gets pushed out of the glomerular capillaries by blood pressure or filtered out, it forms a solution in the glomerular capsule known as the filtrate. About 20% of plasma gets filtered, which means that most of it, 80%, continues out of the glomerular capillaries into the efferent arteriole to the peritubular capillaries. The filtrate, as I mentioned earlier, consists primarily of water, quite a bit of water, along with solute that gets filtered. And that would include salt ions, organic nutrients, and nitrogen waste products. Of course, the filtrate, as it forms, continues on into the first section of the renal tubule, which is the proximal convoluted tubule. There is a structure referred to as the filtration barrier, and it's the barrier that the blood plasma has to be forced through as filtrate forms. And the filtration barrier would be the capillary wall, which is simple squamous, and the wall of the glomerular capsule, which is simple squamous. So the filtration barrier consists of these two layers of simple squamous that are sandwiched together. The second process that forms urine is reabsorption. and I'll abbreviate that with an R. So just, in a very, very brief form, reabsorption is when the filtrate in the renal tubule and the collecting duct moves out of the renal tubule and the collecting duct and becomes plasma once more within the peritubular capillaries. So reabsorption occurs when the filtrate moves out of the renal tubule and the collecting duct and into the blood plasma within the peritubular capillaries. Chemicals that are reabsorbed end up back in the blood, which means that the chemicals that are reabsorbed are not found in the urine. Over 99% of the filtrate gets reabsorbed. And that means that less than 1% of what gets filtered ends up as urine. So you make about 1,200 milliliters of urine a day. That would be about 1.2 liters or somewhere around a quart. And that's far less than the 48 gallons or 180 liters of filtrate that forms in both kidneys across a day. So, what gets reabsorbed? Well, by far, most of the water and the salt ions get reabsorbed. All of the organic nutrients, in other words, 100% of the glucose, the amino acids, and the vitamins get reabsorbed normally in the proximal convoluted tubule. So what doesn't get reabsorbed ends up in the urine, and that includes some of the water, because not all the water is reabsorbed, some of the water, and some of the salt ions, because not all of the salt ions get reabsorbed. So anything that doesn't get reabsorbed, like some of the water and some of the salt ions, ends up in urine. Most of the nitrogen waste products don't get reabsorbed, and as a result you would find urea and ammonia and uric acid, creatinine as well, in urine. Reabsorption is the major determinant of the final composition, or what we find in urine. So this is an overview of reabsorption. So this would be blood in the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerular capillaries, where 20% of the plasma would be filtered, and about 80% of the plasma continues into the efferent arteriole. The filtrate, as it forms in the glomerular capsule, then moves into the renal tubule. The renal tubule would be the proximal convoluted tubule, loop Fenley, and the distal convoluted tubule. From the distal convoluted tubule, at the end of the nephron, the filtrate then goes into the collecting duct. Whatever drips out of the bottom of the papilla of the renal pyramid from papillary ducts is urine. So it's urine that drips into a minor calyx, and it wouldn't be further modified. The urine then goes from the minor calyx to the major calyx to the renal pelvis, and then out of the kidney by way of the ureter to the urinary bladder. And from the urinary bladder, the urine drains out of the body by way of the urethra. Anyway, back to reabsorption. So the filtrate then travels from the glomerular capillary into the proximal convoluted tubule, where reabsorption begins. And reabsorption is the movement of chemicals in the filtrate out of the lumen of the renal tubule, as well as the collecting duct, and into the blood plasma of the peritubular capillaries. Once in the peritubular capillaries, these compounds are destined to flow out of the kidney by way of the renal vein and enter into the inferior vena cava. So 100% of glucose, amino acids, and vitamins is reabsorbed as the filtrate goes down the proximal convoluted tubule. Within the proximal convoluted tubule, about 65% of the water and salt ions are reabsorbed. And reabsorption also occurs in the loop of Henle, as well as the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So secretion is the final of the three processes that we take a look at that forms urine. And just in a nutshell, secretion is when chemicals in the plasma flowing through the peritubular capillaries moves out of the peritubular capillaries and becomes part of the filtrate in the renal tubule, as well as the collecting duct. So secretion is when waste chemicals in the plasma of the peritubular capillaries that did not get filtered at the glomerulus move into the filtrate within the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the collecting duct. So whatever is secreted ends up in the urine. So we'll take a look at what is secreted. And that includes hydrogen ions. And because of hydrogen ion secretion, urine is slightly acidic with a pH of around 6. If the pH of blood is too acidic or too low, below the normal range of 7.35 to 7.45, then the kidneys will increase hydrogen ion secretion in order to get rid of the excess hydrogen ions and bring the pH back up. On the other hand, if the pH of blood is too high or alkaline, say greater than 7.45, then the kidneys will decrease hydrogen ion secretion in order to hold on to hydrogen ions in an attempt to bring the pH back down into the normal range. So, hyperkalemia is a pathological condition where one has very, very high and dangerous levels of potassium ions in the blood. If the potassium ion concentration in the blood is too high, then it can lead to irregular heartbeats or cardiac arrhythmias that can result in cardiac arrest and death. So obviously hyperkalemia is a condition that you'd want to avoid. So it turns out that potassium ions, when in excess within the blood, are secreted by the kidney into the filtrate, and the excess potassium ions then would be lost from the body, which is a good thing, in the urine. The nitrogen waste products like uric acid and ammonia and creatinine are secreted as well. So this is just an overview of secretion. So this would be the filtrate that forms by filtration at the renal corpuscle. And of course the renal corpuscle would be the glomerular capillaries as well as the glomerular capsule. And the filtrate then moves into the renal tubule, moving first into the proximal convoluted tubule, then the loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule, before it enters into a collecting duct. So secretion occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, as well as the collecting duct. And secretion moves chemicals like hydrogen ions and ammonia and potassium ions from blood plasma in the peritubular capillaries out of the peritubular capillaries and into the filtrate. So anything that's been secreted or added to the filtrate would end up in the urine. So now that we've looked at the three processes that form urine, let's talk a little bit about the composition of urine, or in other words, what's in it. So the adult makes about 1,200 milliliters of urine each day. That would be 1.2 liters. And it's a little more than a quart, or a quarter of a gallon of urine per day. Now remember that the two kidneys together form about 48 gallons, or 180 liters of filtrate. And obviously we don't pee or urinate away 48 gallons of urine per day. So that means that by far most of the 180 liters, in fact all but about a liter or so, is reabsorbed. The urine is slightly acidic with a pH of around 6 because of hydrogen ion secretion. And urine as a solution is clear to yellowish in color. Urine is a major source of water loss from the body. In fact, it is the major source of water loss from the body. So there are several ways in which we lose water from the body. We lose it in urine. We lose water vapor, hence water every time we exhale. We lose water when we sweat, and there is a bit of water that we lose in feces. So we always have to drink water in order to replace the water that we lose every day, or we would dehydrate. The urine, in addition to water, contains mineral ions, nitrogen waste products, and hydrogen ions. Abnormal constituents of urine. In other words, these are compounds that you would not find in the urine of a normal person, include the organic nutrients like glucose and amino acids. You would not expect in the urine of a normal person to find proteins or any of the formed elements. So there shouldn't be red cells or white cells or platelets, and certainly shouldn't be hemoglobin as well. The urine that comes out of our body is relatively sterile. So it turns out urine will contain a very, very low population of bacteria. That's normal, but for the most part it's a relatively sterile solution as it comes out of the body. So this is a way of calculating how much of a substance ends up in urine. And the amount in urine would equal how much got filtered. You're going to subtract away what got reabsorbed and put back into plasma, and then add what gets secreted into the filtrate. So glucose, for example. Let's say 100 units of glucose is filtered. We're going to reabsorb all of that, 100%, and glucose isn't secreted. So if you filter 100 and reabsorb 100, there wouldn't be any glucose in the urine. That's the normal situation. With potassium ions, let's say that 100 units of potassium ions get filtered, and we'll reabsorb 70 of those, so there'd be 30 at that point, and then add back 20 potassium ions that get secreted. So if 100 get filtered and 70 get reabsorbed, but 20 get secreted, there would be 50 potassium ions in the urine. With ammonia, let's say that 100 units of ammonia get filtered. Ammonia isn't reabsorbed, but it's secreted. And let's add 50 units of ammonia by secretion. So if 100 units of ammonia get filtered, none get reabsorbed, and an additional 50 units of ammonia get added to the filtrate by secretion, there would be 150 units of ammonia in urine. So here is an overview of the three processes that form urine: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So about 20% of blood plasma gets forced out of the glomerular capillaries by blood pressure and forms the filtrate in the capsular space of the glomerular capsule. The filtrate then continues down the renal tubule and into the collecting duct. During this journey, the filtrate is modified by reabsorption and secretion. What ends up at the papilla of the renal pyramid drips out of the papillary ducts as urine into a minor calyx. So, reabsorption is the movement of materials that we want to keep and do not want to get rid of in urine. And reabsorption is when chemicals in the filtrate move out of the renal tubule and the collecting duct and into the peritubular capillaries, where it would rejoin the general circulation. Secretion is a process that moves unwanted or waste compounds that didn't get filtered from the peritubular capillaries into the proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. So before we move on to other topics, I just wanted to review osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of a solvent, and the only solvent we consider in this class is water, through a semi-permeable membrane. And a semi-permeable membrane is one like the plasma membrane that allows some things to pass through it, but restricts the passage or blocks the passage of others. So when osmosis occurs, we'll see the diffusion of water from one solution through a semi-permeable membrane into another. So let's say that one solution is solution A, and it's hypotonic, and the other solution on the other side of a semi-permeable membrane is solution B, that's hypertonic. So the prefixes hypo and hyper refer to the solute concentration of two solutions that are being compared and found on either side of a semi-permeable membrane. The hypotonic solution is the hypo, or the one with low solute concentration, which means that it's got a high free water concentration. And the hypertonic solution with the hyper is the one that has the higher solute concentration, hence a lower free water concentration. So do make sure that you go back in your notes and review the discussions we've had about osmosis in the past. But what happens with osmosis is that water is going to diffuse from an area of high water concentration through a semi-permeable membrane into an area of lower water concentration. And that also means that when osmosis occurs, water moves from the solution with the low solute to the one with the high solute, and from a hypotonic solution into a hypertonic solution. So I'm going to talk about a couple topics, then we'll finish up with diabetes, micturition, and dialysis. So let's take a look at water reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule. And it turns out it is tied into an osmotic gradient created by the reabsorption of salt. So water will osmose towards a hypertonic solution. And we're going to find that water, when it undergoes osmosis, which is a diffusion of water from an area of high to lower water concentration, that water will follow an osmotic gradient. And in the proximal convoluted tubule, this osmotic gradient is created by the reabsorption of salt. So, whenever I talk about salt, I'm always referring to sodium chloride. So there are other salts associated with the body, but in general, whenever anybody talks about salt, they're always talking about sodium chloride. And if they're not talking about sodium chloride, let's say potassium chloride or magnesium chloride or some of the other salts, they're obligated to tell you that. So you can always assume that when somebody talks about salt in the body, that they're talking about the primary salt ions and the primary salt found in the body, and that's going to be sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, like other salts, when mixed with water, dissociates into sodium ions and chloride ions. So sodium chloride, or salt in the body, exists in the body in an aqueous solution as sodium ions and chloride ions. Now, you should always remember that water follows salt by osmosis. And this is water reabsorption follows salt reabsorption. And the water will follow the salt by osmosis. So we're going to find that as the filtrate moves into the proximal convoluted tubule, sodium ions and chloride ions are moved out of the filtrate into the cells. And the cytosol of the cells then becomes hypertonic, and water will move into the cells. And then the salt ions are moved out of the cells into the interstitial fluid, and the interstitial fluid becomes hypertonic. And water then will move out of the cells by osmosis into the hypertonic interstitial fluid, and then the salt ions move into blood plasma, and water follows that as well. So these are the simple cuboidal epithelial cells that line the renal tubule. We're going to look at the effect of antidiuretic hormone, and in order to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about how the loop of Henle concentrates salt in the interstitial fluid around it. So again, just to re-emphasize, salt is going to be sodium chloride. That's table salt. And you should just assume when people talk about salt in your body that they're talking about sodium chloride. Sodium chloride will dissociate when mixed with water, and that's the case in all the fluid compartments of the body, into sodium ions and chloride ions. So salt is going to be sodium chloride, and salt in the solutions of the body exist as sodium ions and chloride ions. So there are epithelial cells that line the ascending branch of the loop of Henle, and they move sodium ions and chloride ions, or salt, into the interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle. So this is going to be the loop of Henle, and the filtrate would flow down and around the bottom into the distal convoluted tubule. So this would be the descending branch of the loop of Henle, and then this would be the ascending branch of the loop of Henle, following the flow of the filtrate. There are cells within the wall of the ascending branch that move sodium ions and chloride ions, in other words salt, into the interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle. And the result of that is that the interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle has a very, very high concentration of salt, sodium chloride, and is very hypertonic as a result. And we're going to find that the high concentration of salt, or sodium chloride, around the loop of Henle sets up an osmotic gradient that water flows along from the collecting duct into the interstitial fluid, and from there into the peritubular capillaries. And this occurs in response to the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ADH regulated water reabsorption that occurs from the collecting duct. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin, but I prefer antidiuretic hormone. and ADH. ADH is secreted by the posterior portion of the pituitary gland. Usually we just call that the posterior pituitary. The term diuresis means to make urine. So antidiuresis is something that opposes the formation of urine. And that's the case with antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone will increase the permeability of collecting duct cells to water. Permeability means how easily water flows through these cells. The result of ADH's effect to increase the permeability of collecting duct cells to water is that water will osmose out of the hypotonic filtrate in the collecting duct through these cells into the hypertonic interstitial fluid with the high salt concentration around the loop of Henle. And once the water has osmosed into this interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle, it will flow into the peritubular capillaries and become plasma. The water that's reabsorbed in this fashion would not end up in the urine, and as a result, ADH's effect on the kidney would be to decrease urine volume. The stimulus for the release of ADH from the pituitary is dehydration. And dehydration is sometimes known as a negative water balance state. There's too little water in the body. So let's take a look at ADH regulated water reabsorption with this flow chart. So this is a homeostatic mechanism that helps to regulate water balance, or the proper amount of water in the body. So let's assume that we start with a normal water balance, normal amount of water. You're not overhydrated, you're not underhydrated or dehydrated. You've got a normal amount of water in the body. And we're going to assume that you become dehydrated. So how might that happen? I don't know, you go for a long period of time without drinking. Maybe you are walking across the Grand Canyon or some other hike somewhere and you didn't bring water with you and you've been sweating a lot. So sweating will do it. Chronic diarrhea. You can lose a lot of water if you have chronic diarrhea, and that can lead to dehydration. In any event, dehydration, which is a negative water balance in the body where you have too little water, less than normal, will stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, from the posterior pituitary. And that will increase the permeability of the collecting duct cells to water, so that water now will flow through these cells. Water's always going to osmose along an osmotic gradient. So the water will osmose out of the collecting duct and into the hypertonic interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle, and from there into the peritubular capillaries. Whatever gets reabsorbed, and that's the case here, does not end up in the urine. So the reabsorption of water out of the collecting duct, ultimately into the peritubular capillaries, would decrease the amount of water in urine, hence decrease urine volume. So this would be ADH's effect to increase the permeability of these epithelial cells that line the collecting duct to water. And as a result, water would osmose out of the collecting duct through these cells into the hypertonic interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle, and the water that's reabsorbed in this fashion would simply move into the peritubular capillaries. So, ADH is released when a person is dehydrated. That's helpful because ADH helps to prevent further water loss from the body when it's dehydrated to decrease urine volume. So ADH essentially just helps you conserve or retain your body water, but that isn't the final solution. The final solution to dehydration is to drink water. And if you don't replace the fluids that you lost, you get more and more dehydrated, and at some point in time that can lead to cardiac arrest, kidney failure, and death. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the kidney and diabetes mellitus. I actually plan to talk more about diabetes mellitus when we hit the endocrinology section of this course, which of course is our final topic before the final exam. So diabetes is pretty familiar probably to everybody, because the latest statistics I could find were from 2018, and they indicate that 34 million people in the United States have diabetes. So the U.S. population is about 330 million people, and that means that about 10%, or 1 out of every 10 individuals that you encounter, is a diabetic. And obviously it is a pretty big issue, health issue in the United States, and around the world for that matter. So there's 2 types of diabetes mellitus, and we've talked about both of these already. But type 1 is less common, and it's an autoimmune disease where the white cells of the body attack and destroy the beta cells within the pancreatic islets. And as a result, these beta cells, once they've been destroyed, aren't replaced, and type 1 diabetics do not make insulin. And as a result, they have to have regular injections of insulin every day in order to control their blood sugar or glucose levels. A type 2 diabetic is far more common, and they produce insulin, but the target cells for insulin are not fully responsive to the insulin, so they don't have a good insulin effect. And as a result, they have problems regulating blood glucose levels, and they can often control type 2 diabetes with lifestyle changes, possibly medications. And I think some type 2 diabetics actually take some supplemental insulin as well. So there are 3 symptoms that we're going to talk about associated with diabetes mellitus, and they include hyperglycemia, which would be abnormally high levels of glucose in the blood, glucosuria, which is a pathological condition where you find glucose in the urine, and there shouldn't be any glucose in the urine, because in a normal individual it would be 100% reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. And polyuria. And polyuria is when an individual urinates a lot more than you'd expect. In fact, they lose so much water as they urinate a lot that it can lead to dehydration, and as a result that would make them thirsty all the time. So a diabetic has high blood sugar levels, they've got glucose that you can test for in the urine, and they tend to urinate a lot, and as a result they're thirsty. I did want to mention just a few things about aldosterone because it does have functions associated with the kidney. So aldosterone is abbreviated ALDO, and it is a steroid hormone secreted by the cortex of the adrenal gland. That's the same area of the adrenal gland that secretes cortisol. Remember that epinephrine comes from the medulla, or inner portion of the adrenal gland. So aldosterone is a steroid hormone secreted by the cortex of the adrenal gland, and it has several effects associated with the kidney. First of all, aldosterone will increase the reabsorption of salt, sodium chloride, from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. And the reabsorption of salt creates an osmotic gradient that water follows by osmosis. So salt reabsorption leads to water reabsorption. And water that's reabsorbed doesn't appear in the urine, so this effect of aldosterone would decrease urine volume. And aldosterone, like ADH, is an antidiuretic. Aldosterone will also stimulate an increase in potassium ion secretion in order to get rid of excess potassium ions. So there are several stimuli that will stimulate the release of aldosterone in order for aldosterone to homeostatically correct the condition. If the blood pressure drops too low, it'll kick in RAS, and that will stimulate kidney cells to release renin, which, as we know, leads to the formation of angiotensin II, but also stimulates the release of aldosterone. And if the levels of potassium ions are too high in blood plasma, and you're trending towards hyperkalemia, which can be fatal, then this will stimulate the release of aldosterone, which would increase the secretion of these excess potassium ions to control the potassium ion balance in the body. Micturition essentially is urination. Micturition is the process of emptying the bladder when you urinate. So I'm going to go through a flow chart showing the events associated with this process of micturition when the bladder empties as one urinates. So urinary bladder over time, and this can be several hours, will fill up with urine. At some point, as the bladder fills, you stretch the walls of the urinary bladder, and that stimulates stretch receptors. The stretch receptors in the wall of the urinary bladder, as it fills, will send impulses into the spinal cord, where they stimulate the parasympathetic neurons and the lateral horns of the spinal cord gray matter. The parasympathetic neurons, when stimulated by the stretch receptors, then send out motor impulses to their axonal endings, and they release acetylcholine, because these will be cholinergic effects of these parasympathetic motor neurons. The release of acetylcholine by parasympathetic motor neurons will stimulate the contraction of smooth muscle in the wall of the urinary bladder that pushes urine out. Collectively, the smooth muscle within the wall of the urinary bladder is referred to as the detrusor muscle. So the parasympathetic motor neurons, the release of acetylcholine, will cause the detrusor muscle in the urinary bladder wall to contract, and that helps to push the urine into the urethra. You can't push the urine into the urethra until you relax the internal urethral sphincter muscle. So right where the urethra begins, at the bottom of the urinary bladder, there is a circular arrangement of smooth muscle cells known as the internal urethral sphincter muscle. And these parasympathetic motor neurons not only contract the detrusor muscle, but they relax the internal urethral sphincter. So now urine can flow out of the bladder and into the urethra. You can still control when you will urinate because there's one other muscle, and it's a skeletal muscle called the external urethral sphincter muscle. And you can voluntarily stimulate that muscle to contract, to hold back the urine until you're ready to urinate. And finally, just a little bit about dialysis. Dialysis is used as a treatment by people that have kidney failure. If you have kidney failure, your kidneys aren't working, and as a result, you're not filtering blood and forming urine, and that can cause waste products like ammonia and excess potassium ions to accumulate and kill you within days. So if you have kidney failure, you have to resort to dialysis or honestly die. So dialysis involves the use of a dialysis machine that often is referred to as an artificial kidney that you send your blood through, and it removes waste products from the blood. Dialysis is performed generally at a dialysis center where you would go 3 times per week, and each time you go you would spend up to 4 or 5 hours purifying your blood of waste products. This is a huge commitment and a huge hassle. It also means that if you schedule a vacation, for example, you're going from Gainesville to Myrtle Beach, you'd have to call ahead to a dialysis center in Myrtle Beach and schedule yourself for dialysis if you're going to stay a week.